you go. All
Hey,
right.
there we are. All right. Okay. I haven't now, like I said, I've been doing these for 2 decades. And normally I have all things prepared and ready to go, but I wanted to make this kind of more of just a chat, right? To help people understand what it is we're hoping to accomplish with the Camp 1872 Ghost of the Buffalo Grass thing. And so much of this obviously is based on your work. So let's first of all, let's talk about a little bit about who you are. I understand you're a Louisiana girl who took an interest in Russian history. What in the world were you doing studying Russian history at Tulane, right?
Yeah. So actually my interest in Russia started when I was in high school. I had a friend who was 2 years ahead of me in school, and she went off to college and she went to Yale, and she wanted to be a journalist in Russia. And so she started studying the Russian language. And so that got me interested in Russia. And I started reading books on my own in high school about Russian history, which did not go over well with some people. I had teachers who asked me if I was a communist. I mean,
yeah, I can imagine.
The early 80s in Southern Louisiana. But yeah, so I got really interested in Russian history when I was about 16. And so when I went to undergrad, I wanted to study Russian history. Unfortunately, I just didn't have the opportunity to take any Russian history at that time. But when I graduated, I went on to grad school at Tulane. And there they had a Russian history professor. And so I worked with him.
All right. Now, I assume you probably learned Russian?
I did. So I took a little bit of Russian language as an undergrad. And then when I got to grad school, I went and spent 2 summers at Middlebury College, which has an intensive summer language program, and where you only speak the language you're learning. So I did that for 2 summers, which was very intense. And then I started going to Russia on a regular basis. And that's when my Russian really got up to speed.
Wow. So what parts of Russia have you been to then?
I have been really lucky. I have traveled a lot in Russia. So the main places I did research were Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Right.
But I've been able to take excursions to many other places. I've been to what used to be called Stalingrad, now Volgograd.
Right.
I've been to some of what they call the ring cities. I've been to, I actually did a recruiting tour for my university a couple of years ago, and I was able to go all the way to Siberia. So in one trip, I went from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok, which was quite a trip and quite exhausting. But I've been to Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, and Vladivostok as well.
Wow. Wow.
So I've been to lots of Russian cities. I've been really lucky.
Well, I took an interest in the last Tsar and his family, you know, and that whole Ekaterinburg and the killing of the family and all that. I mean, that's kind of what stimulated a little bit of my interest. And of course, I've sad to say, I had an uncle, although I never had an opportunity to meet him because he died at 19, who was part of the Russian campaign on the German side in World War II. And he ended up being killed down in extreme southeastern Ukraine.
Wow.
And he's in a military grave there. So that kind of piqued my interest. I was born within less than a mile of the East German border.
Oh.
That's a long story, and we won't go into that. But I had sort of I've been to Berlin, and when it was still divided, and there's the East German side, and the reason I was always tickled by this, the reason they built the wall was to keep the West out.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. But anyway, so let's get onto the subject here. So you took an interest in Russian history. You have a degree in that. I gather you're at Auburn University in Montgomery,
Mhm.
and you're what, assistant department head or department head of
I'm the chair of the department right now.
chair of department right now? Great. So you've written a number of books. The one that interests me, and the reason we're getting together, is this one. Alexis in America. Just briefly, what was the catalyst for that? Why did you decide to pick this particular topic to write about?
So that kind of also has kind of a funny story. I was working at the special collections at Tulane's Library as a graduate student.
I'm going to hold it up so
And
you can see it.
okay, and a friend of mine, and I grew up in Louisiana, so I grew up going to Mardi Gras parades and participating in Mardi Gras activities, but I never paid attention to the history of Mardi Gras, as is often the case when you live someplace.
Right.
And a friend of mine said, there's this like Russian connection to Mardi Gras. And I was like, really? And so I started looking through the Mardi Gras histories, and I saw the purported connection between Grand Duke Alexis and Mardi Gras.
Right. Yeah.
And in the popular lore in Mardi Gras history, it says that part of the reason Alexis went to New Orleans is because he was following a burlesque performer that he had become smitten with while he was traveling in the United States. Her name was Lydia Thompson. And that a group of men decided to create this Mardi Gras organization, in part because Alexis was going to be there, and that they chose the theme song of the organization, which is called The Krewe of Rex, as a sort of a gentle poke at Alexis, because the song they chose is called If Ever I Cease to Love, which was a song that the burlesque performer Lydia Thompson was singing in her performance of Bluebeard. Okay. Now, that story is, none of that is really accurate, as is often the case with popular history, right? The stories are better than the truth. Alexis did not go to New Orleans to see Lydia.
Rex he was there to meet his fleet, I understand, right?
Yeah, he went to lots of cities while he was in the United States. So going to New Orleans was not because of Lydia Thompson. He was very much in love with someone else, as we'll talk about. Right. In addition, the Krewe of Rex was organized not because of Alexis. There were already conversations about how they needed to sort of make Mardi Gras a little more organized, because it had been just kind of more spontaneous before, and this organization actually strived to make it more orderly and to have a daytime celebration. But that was unrelated to Alexis. It had to do more with tourism. And then the selection of the song also was not because of Alexis, because that song was incredibly popular. When I did my research, I found that there were lots of parodies of that song in the newspapers. And so I can understand why the rumors emerged that these things were all linked, but in fact, they just sort of coincidentally happened at the same time.
Right.
But in any event, that's how I became aware of this topic. And when I realized that Alexis had traveled all over the United States and that no one had written anything about it, I couldn't believe my good fortune in finding a topic that was so colorful and interesting and still untapped. So I jumped on it.
All right, that sounds great. So this had happened in what, 2010, 2015 timeframe?
No. I started working on this when I was still working on my dissertation, but I sort of just, plodded along until I had to get my first book done first. So, normally the pattern is you turn your dissertation into your first book. Right. So I had to do that first so I could get tenure here at AUM. And then I started working on the Grand Duke Alexis book, and it came out in 2014.
Okay. Well, let's talk about who this Grand Duke Alexis character is. He's 22 years old. He's I believe, the fourth son of Tsar Alexander II, the Tsar of all of Russia, or Russias, or however they would pronounce that. So let's talk about this. It's a young guy, full of vim and vigor, tall, handsome, debonair, well-spoken, speaks English well, and a number of other languages besides obviously Russian. So let's talk. Tell us a little bit about him.
So Alexis was born in 1850, and as you said, he was the fourth son of Tsar Alexander II, who, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar, Alexander II is the Tsar. He's referred to as the liberator Tsar. He's the Tsar who liberated the serfs in Russia in 1861. So he's one of the, you know, quote unquote good czars of the 19th century. He has a pretty good reputation overall. Alexis he was 21 when he arrived in the United States.
Yeah.
And he turned 22 during the buffalo hunt. So he was a
Right.
very young
Right.
man. And yes, he was handsome and tall, and he spoke several languages. Of course, he spoke Russian, but he also spoke French and German, and he apparently spoke English very well. He had been raised like an heir, or rather like a son of the Tsar. He was not the heir.
Right.
But as was typical of all the male children of a Tsar, he was assigned to a branch of the armed services. And so he was assigned to the Navy. So he
Yeah.
grew up from a young age learning how to sail. And of course, learning the other sorts of things that one would learn as the son of a Tsar. So he learned how to ride horses and so on and so forth. He was not a particularly great student. So he did get chided for, you know, not getting good marks all the time. But, you know, there's something very charming about that, because I think that, you know, that humanizes him in many ways. He was, you know, traveling the world at a fairly young age because of his naval assignment. Right. There was a man assigned to him as kind of a guardian, a governor, and his name was Admiral Konstantin Posset. He would travel with Alexis to the United States. And I don't remember the exact age that he began to sort of be the, you know, guardian of Alexis, but from a fairly young age, Alexis, you know, once he reached a certain age, he was kind of turned over to these male guardians as opposed to like nannies. And that's when he started learning these kinds of manly pursuits.
Right. Well, he obviously wants to come out here to not only see America, but one of his requests is he wants to hunt buffalo. And I gathered that there is some kind of a reference there that he had been, you know, had spent some time in the Caucasus, or, you know, the Cossacks, and of course they were renowned, you know, horsemen. And of course, right around the time that he's still a young child, they have the Crimean War and all that going on. So let's talk a little bit about the politics of what brought him. Why did his dad, his father, the Tsar, decide to pack him off to the United States?
Okay, so, you know, one of the things that people don't often realize is that Russia and the United States had a really good relationship actually during this period of time. Yeah. So you mentioned the Crimean War, which took place in the 1850s when Alexis would have been a very small child. The United States did not get involved in that, nor would they necessarily have wanted to. But given the fact that, you know, Russia fought against both France and Britain, the fact that the United States wasn't involved in that was a plus for the United States in terms of Russian-American relations. By this point, Russia and the United States already had some trade activities going. And then during the 1860s, it was a particularly good time for Russian-American relations. So our Civil War started in 1861.
Right.
And of course, both France and Great Britain at various points considered getting involved in some kind of way. And Russia did not do that. So that was again, something that sort of made the two countries favor one another. In 1863, Russia actually sent a fleet to the United States. And although Russia had its own reasons for doing that, it was certainly perceived by people in the north of the United States as a sign of Russia's support for the Union.
Right.
So that was another sort of strike in favor of Russian-American relations. Then in 1867, we purchased Alaska from Russia. Right. And again, that was a good deal for both of us. So by the time 1871 rolled around, Russia and the United States both had gone through some pretty significant things. In Russia, of course, there had been a number of serious reforms, including the abolition of serfdom. In the United States, we had completed our Civil War, which had, of course, involved the liberation of the slaves. And so both countries saw it as an opportunity to sort of redefine their relationship.
Right.
And the United States had actually been sending an invitation to Russia for a couple of years to send a member of the royal family over. And so Alexander had undoubtedly thought about doing so. And now it seemed like a good time to do it. And there was a particular reason he wanted to send Alexis as opposed to one of his other sons.
Heartbreak.
Yes. So here's where the romance comes in. So
Right.
Alexis, you know, at the tender age of 21, was very much in love with an older woman. She was about 8 years his senior.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, her name was Alexandra Zhukovskaya. And she was the daughter of a very famous Russian poet and tutor. So she was of nobility, but she was not of royal blood. Now, it would have been fine had Alexis wanted to have an affair with this woman, as long as he married appropriately to someone of royal blood and you know, fulfilled his obligation to the family and the throne. And many royal members of the family had done that. They married according to the rules, and then they'd had lovers on the side. This would not have been
including his father.
Including his father, right. And many of his relatives. So this in and of itself would not have been so problematic. But in this case, first of all, Alexis was very young and he had not yet married. So he became seriously involved with this woman before he fulfilled this obligation to marry royalty. And he was very hung up on her. He was very in love with her and he wanted to marry her. And he was quite insistent about this. And his parents had made it clear that that was not going to happen, but he would not give up on it. And in the early part of 1871, Alexandra became pregnant with his child. So by the time Alexis was sent to the United States, and by the time his parents had decided that he was definitely going to the United States, Alexandra was already carrying his child. So you can understand why his parents thought that maybe getting him away from Russia for a little while might solve this problem. It might sort of quell this passion and maybe he would lose interest.
Well, I guess they'd been corresponding for quite a while. I mean, I think he was still very much in his teens when he was introduced to her, and she was brought into one of the royal palaces with her father or whatever. And they'd had been a platonic relationship that evolved into something more, I gather.
Yeah. And you know, and I mean, 8 years is a pretty big difference at that age. You know, I mean, like at our ages, an 8-year difference between a man and a woman isn't that big a deal. But I think any of us can imagine that if your 20-year-old son was in love with a 28-year-old, somebody you already knew that they couldn't marry, you might be a little concerned. That's a pretty big age difference. So, and then when she turns up pregnant, of course, I think we can all understand, you know, his parents' dismay at that situation. Right.
So the idea then they'd been sending, apparently the US government had been inviting, you know, them to send somebody to the royal house over to visit. Let's talk a little, what's sort of the evolution of why did they, I guess he was the logical choice. I mean, he had 4 brothers, but I think by this time the heir apparent had died, so it moved on then to another one of his brothers.
Right. So the brother who ended up inheriting the throne was his older brother Alexander. So he became Alexander the Third. Yeah. So there could have been other sons that they sent to Russia. There were several older than Alexis who might have been more logical choices for diplomatic reasons, but clearly the diplomatic reasons were overshadowed, I think, when it came to the choice of which son to send, and they decided to send Alexis.
And avoid a little bit of scandal too, damp it down. Let's talk about the Russian ambassador to Washington, D.C., which I think that's a book you're just
hold on a second. Hold on.
Yeah.
I actually, so I, yeah, I finally
There
got
you
a copy
go.
of my own book. So it came out and like the reviewers and other people had copies and I still had not received one
Oh
yet.
my.
So this is actually down here is a picture of the guy. His name is Konstantin Kadakazi. You can see his last name
Right.
out there. Um, and so this is a story that I had to research while I was writing the Alexis book. And then I realized that it was an entire story unto itself. And that's how I ended up writing that book. But so he had arrived as the Russian ambassador to the United States in 1869. So after the Alaska Purchase. And from the moment he arrived on America's shores, he made himself thoroughly disliked by the American government. He apparently had a really kind of prickly personality, just one of those people who is always kind of needling and poking and asking favors and
Has to be the alpha dog in the room.
pestering. And so very early on, Hamilton Fish, who was Secretary of State, began to complain about this guy and just say, like, you know, basically like he's driving me nuts, right? He asks me about this, he asks me about that, he wants to know if he can do this. And so he, you know, he was sort of personally annoying to people. He didn't follow protocol and things like that, but he also did some things that were really problematic. So he had a nasty habit of leaking information to the press. And in some cases, we think he probably wrote the articles himself and then just fed them to reporters.
Yeah.
In other cases, he clearly talked to reporters. And articles would show up in the newspapers that just commented on Russian-American relations or things like that in a way that was inappropriate for the day. So, you know, nowadays we sort of expect to see anything in the newspaper. Back then, though, there was certainly the expectation that within politics, you know, those kinds of conversations would only take place between politicians and people within the government, and it was against policy, basically against protocol, to talk about things like this with the press. And he did this all the time.
He couldn't have gotten away with this in St. Petersburg, could he?
No, absolutely
That kind of
not.
action, yeah.
No, absolutely not. And there were other things that he did as well. So, you know, at this time, the United States was embroiled in a battle with Great Britain over the Alabama claims regarding some raider ships during
Right.
during the Civil War, and Kadakazi seemed to be sort of meddling in that as well, meddling in the settlement of those claims. And not only American politicians, but British politicians as well believed that he was trying to sort of, you know, mess in our relations there.
Sure. Probably over the defeat in the Crimean War, and just it
would benefit Russia if the United States and Britain were at odds.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, that was the, you know, that was the reason there. But so there were just, you know, he just did lots of things like this. He just meddled in American affairs, meddled in things that were not his business. He was a gossip, and spread information, sometimes inaccurately, sometimes information that might be accurate that he had no business sharing. And so by the early summer of 1871, which is after, you know, it has already been decided that Alexis is going to come to the United States, the US government decided they'd had enough of him, and they requested that the Russian government recall him. And of course, the government in Russia responded negatively to this, because they said, you know, we can't send the son of the czar to the United States if a representative of our country isn't there.
Not there, yeah.
So it was decided that the US government would, and they use this word, tolerate Kadakazi until the end of the Grand Duke's visit, but he would be persona non grata, and he could only perform his duties as related to Alexis's visit. And so that really sort of cast a chill over the visit in some places, particularly when Alexis visited Grant in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, who was the president at the time.
Right. So, yeah, it was quite an enormous scandal. And after Kadakazi finally leaves, he continues for years to try and get a position in the Russian government that was equal to the one that he had when he was ambassador, and he never succeeds. But he never gives up, you know, pestering people about it. So there's a whole story there that's quite interesting.
Right. That's another book. But he sort of plays a pivotal role in the adventures of Alexei when he comes to the United States, particularly the reception that Alexei receives when he goes to Washington, and then
Mhm.
why they don't want to go back for another longer,
Right.
all that. But there's a role. I mean, I like you, I kept coming across this. I said, well, who is this guy? And
Mhm.
then I dug a little deeper, like you did, into it, not as deep as you have, but let's briefly get into some DC gossip. What was the story about his mistress or his wife,
Oh, yeah. So
South
that was
America?
that's one really interesting part of Katakazi's story. So apparently at some point he met this woman um when she was married, and it's unclear whether they ran away together or she got divorced first, but in any case there was something, slightly
Scandalous.
scandalous, yes, that happened there. And he ended up winning her away from her husband somehow and marrying her. And so when he became ambassador to the United States, he brought her with him as his wife. But of course, people knew about this scandalous past. And so the
Right.
Washington wives received her kind of coldly. And that ended up impacting relations between Katakazi and Hamilton Fish, because Hamilton Fish's wife was sort of the grande dame of Washington society.
Right.
And if she did not accept Mrs. Katakazi, then other women would follow her lead. And so I have an entire chapter actually in the Katakazi book that discusses this, because ultimately, I was able to find evidence in Hamilton Fish's diaries and letters that this actually was affecting his ability to interact with Katakazi. And Katakazi was complaining if he wasn't invited to things. And so it ended up adding another layer of scandal to this already scandalous man.
So Fish is taking some cues from his wife then.
Well,
his relations with.
Yeah, I mean, it's, or at the very least, they invite Katakazi and his wife only to things where it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
And they don't invite them to some things where it would be normal for them to be invited, but not required.
Yeah.
But in that world of Washington society, it was really clear if someone was being snubbed, because there were pretty clear rules about what you did in terms of inviting people, returning invitations, visits and returning visits, and so on and so forth. The rules were pretty strict, and it was one area where women had a lot of control, and so they exerted that control. They applied that control because they still couldn't vote. So this was where they had a lot of power.
Yeah.
And it could affect politics, as other examples have shown. So,
all right, now, so into this Washington maelstrom sails a little fleet of 3 Russian Navy ships, one of which, interestingly, did they ever explain why Alexei's ship arrived the last one?
it just got delayed along the way.
Yeah, it just got delayed along. So they set sail then from St. Petersburg. They spent some time in was it France? I think they stopped on the way, or
they
something.
Stopped in England. I think they stopped in Marseille, and also in Spain. And then eventually they made their way to the US.
Right. Now, I guess we should talk a little bit too about the Russian nobility had connections to Queen Victoria and, Denmark and Germany. In fact, his mother was German, I believe, was she not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. By the way, I'm Hessian, just so you know. Not really, half Hessian. But anyway, so they're making he's making these trips and things through Europe. I guess they spent a lot of time in Italy and places like that. So
yeah, I mean, on this visit, he didn't spend a lot of
Right.
time there, but yeah.
Right. Okay, so they set sail. I think when did it was sometime in the fall. I think he arrived
In August, and he arrives in the US in late November.
In late November, right. So he arrives in New York. There's a big festival setting. How did who planned that itinerary for him? I mean, originally the idea he was going to cross the continent. He was going to end up on the West Coast as well, and that got evolved and changed a little bit. So how did the itinerary get set up? Who did that?
So initially, Kadakazi sent sort of a recommended itinerary to Russia. And it's kind of funny knowing what I know about Kadakazi, because the response from Russia was kind of like, sort of slow your roll, right? Like, you don't need to plan it all out. We're going to plan this, they wanted his input, his recommendations, but they didn't want him planning the whole thing. And they told him, like, do not start planning this trip, like, we are going to plan this trip. And so basically it's clear that they had some recommendations in mind when they started, but they kind of let Alexis and Admiral Pausiat choose where they would go next. So when Alexis arrived in New York, there were lots of representatives from other cities that came there and presented invitations to him. And that largely determined where he was going. So he did refuse some invitations, but he accepted a lot of invitations as well. I'm sure I could never find a precise document that said exactly what they thought they were going to do when they got there, but clearly some of the major Eastern cities would have been on their agenda. But they had initially talked about going all the way to San Francisco, and that was canceled. There were initially some conversations about going to the Southeast, but it was decided not to go there because the rail lines were still very much disrupted by the war. There was also some concern about, they
were having like yellow fever outbreaks and things.
Well, but they were kind of concerned about, I don't necessarily want to use the word violence, but the area was still not 100% stable given the post-war situation. So I think they had some reservations about traveling there.
Okay.
Yellow fever was in the Northeast. That was a concern.
Oh, that was north. Okay. Yeah. All right. So in this mix, and we will, if you're good, what we want to do is we want to pick the story up in another segment where we actually get him out into the plains. And here by the way, in case everybody knows, I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, or near Omaha, Nebraska. In fact, the location of the Union Pacific Rail line that he traveled is that way, just a mile or so, or what's left of it. There's just a little bit of it left there, of that original line that came right through here, the town of Papillion. So I've got kind of a interest in that because he actually was near here briefly as the train chugged by at 30 or 40 miles an hour, whatever it was. So we want to touch on that segment of the story a little in another interview, if you're good with that. Mm-hmm. But we have this whole story that is woven, that involves Indians and involves buffalo, it involves Bill Cody and George Custer and wild buffalo hunt that way. About 300 miles, which I had the opportunity to actually go to the site last April and walk on the ground where the hunt took place, or where the camp was, not where the hunt took place, but where the camp was. And that property, by the way, is still owned by the original ranching family, the Mintlings, who homesteaded or ranched that area. The plaque says 1885, so they came a little after. Obviously, it wasn't in the family's possession at the time of the encampment was there. But that's another story that we want to talk about. If you're good with that, Kate.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Right. Good. Well, look, this has been fun. This has been joy. I love this topic. I'm going to put the book up. Is it still in print? Can people still get a copy?
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon.
Okay. I think that's where I got my copy, as a matter of fact. So that is great. Well, look, and then at some point we want to, maybe you can share with us. I know you've recently gave a lecture on this up in Boston. Mm-hmm. So there's some interest there. It's the 100, technically next January 13th through the 15th is the 150th anniversary of what has become known as the Royal Buffalo Hunt.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure most people are, particularly here in Nebraska, I don't know how many people are aware of the fact that it took place here. And we had a rare conjunction of, I like to talk about the three cultures: Russian culture, European American culture, and Native American culture. And they all happily work together. which is a rare, given what's happened in the last 150 years.
Yeah.
It was a bright moment in American and Russian and Lakota history. So anyway, so we want to talk about that next time if you're good with that.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, sounds good. Lee, thank you so much for taking the time and doing this. I know you've got another call coming up here, and I appreciate all the time you've taken. So